Welcome. Very excited to have a book talk with Brian Penbrass and Noah Pickus uh, on their book, The Global University, Reinventing Education in the 21st Century. Um, and it's published by Princeton University Press. And so we have about an hour, and if you do have some questions, you can send them in the chat. We have a bunch already lined up. We hope it'll be mostly conversational here. But the format would be that I'll say a few words and introduce our speakers, and then they'll give a short kind of summary of things they want to say, and then we'll get into a conversation about the book. I'm John Douglas here at the Center for Studies in Higher Education. Brian, I think I'll say a few comments first. One, as I was just telling Brian and Noah, this is a really great book. I saw an earlier draft when Brian was a visiting researcher here at the center, and it was more about the case studies at that time, which were very interesting, absolutely. But the book has been added that they've really created a tremendous synthesis and thinking about what is liberal arts education, where does it sit in the world, what lessons do we get out of these case studies that they have? They have 8 case studies. And so it's very thoughtful. I have a little joke, a thought is it's a little bit though also the liberal arts are dead, long live the liberal arts, in that kind of giving this sense that there's a rebirth that needs to happen and is happening in various places. And they really do an excellent job of providing a roadmap as to how more institutions might be thinking or be pursuing liberal arts, but largely new institutions. Their focus is really about basically you need to start over, and they have some heavy criticisms towards larger major universities of the world in the US. I would like to note though, while we see this kind of renaissance of liberal arts in various parts of the world, in a backdrop, one is a real strain that's going on in the United States because we've had such a devotion to largely private, small liberal arts colleges, and many of them are failing. They don't have enrollment demand, they don't have the money, and there's a merger process going on. So there is a kind of an interesting juxtaposition between the two. I'd only also say that, well, these are really interesting institutions and case studies, and there is a real need for them in the world. The question is, though, what's the scalability of them? Are they not scalable? They're kind of largely boutique, I would say, but still very important, only to note that. So let me say a few words about our speakers. Brian is professor of astronomy and vice president of external academic relations and sponsored research at SoCA University, which is down in Laguna Beach area. I had a chance to visit him one time there. It's a really interesting place. It has links with the Japanese Buddhist traditions. I don't know how you say it, but it's its own independent liberal arts college. Very interesting place. He's also been a professor of astronomy at Pomona College. He was part of the founding group that helped put together the Yale NUS, National University of Singapore college. Also very extremely interesting, and in one of the case studies, he's been a visiting researcher here at the center. One of his books, among many other things, is STEM Education for the 21st Century, and he also wrote a chapter with me on what's going on in Hong Kong and Singapore in a book I put together called Neo-Nationalism in Universities. Noah is Associate Provost and Professor of Practice at Duke University. He's been at Duke for 25 years. He just informed me that he grew up in Berkeley, so he left and never returned, I guess. He was the chief academic officer for the Minerva Project, and that's the difference between the project and Minerva University. I was not completely knowledgeable about that, but I know Terry Cannon very well as one of our was the founding president for Minerva University, and I know she was very enthusiastic about this book. So that's also a very interesting case study in the book. He's also been involved with the Duke Kunshan University project in China, co-director of the Arizona State University Georgetown University Academic for Innovation and Higher Education Leadership Intensive Program. That's all the same thing, right? No, that's got to be a heck of an acronym. And among his books is Liberal Arts and Science and Innovation in China. Okay, so again, really fantastic book. You guys did a really interesting job. It sits, I think, in the research literature as relatively unique. Of course, you wrote most of it before COVID, so there's some of those aspects, and we'll return to it. So now let me turn it over to you, and you can just, about 10 minutes or so, say what you'd like to say about the book.
Okay, thanks, John. It's great to be able to share the book with you and everyone else. And Noah and I will both give a short little riffs on some of our key takeaways, which actually form the basis of our last chapter, where we switch over into this kind of reflective mode. And we actually, at the end, also realized that we hadn't found all the answers to the questions that we started with, but hopefully that by investigating these universities in some detail, we were able to at least ground those questions in a lot more experience, a lot more substantive data, and a lot of stories. And really, the book is written around the stories of founders, and takes the kind of the academic version of this book called Founders at Work, if you've been familiar with it. And one of the things that I started with was looking into questions about how parallels between corporate entrepreneurship and academic entrepreneurship may or may not exist, where the parallels exist, and where the two sectors are so different that they just are irreconcilable. They're just separate. And this partly as a means to finding some of that same kind of energy and dynamism that we see in some of the corporate sector transported into the ways that universities can think and position themselves within a marketplace and be more competitive, and of course also to have a more sustainable business model, which is threatening a lot of the universities, and as you mentioned, many liberal arts colleges. So we were interested, both Noah and I, from our personal experience in startup universities, which are exciting, dramatic, harrowing, exhilarating all at the same time. If you're part of it, they use a term, kind of instead of dog years, they talk about startup years, where 1 year of your life at a startup is sort of like 7 years in a normal university, because everything is happening so fast. And it's somewhat like laying railroad tracks in front of the locomotive as it's moving, or assembling the plane as it's rolling along the air tarmac. So these kinds of energetic, creative, improvisational, but also deeply creative forces are all brought to bear on creating these new universities. And so we also found them as sort of crucibles of academic vision and leadership. And we were really able to pull out from the stories in the book some really incredible people who started these 8 universities, and how they set up a vision, attracted others to support that vision, and were able to answer some of the impossible questions of how do you actually start a university. And we actually list some of these questions in the beginning of the book, which we call 6-dimensional chess. How do you start a new university and create a brand when no one knows who you are? How in the world do you get the money needed to do this? How do you get faculty to commit their careers to an institution that doesn't even exist? How do you design a curriculum? How do you build a campus? How do you get an effective governance? All these things have to be established and figured out simultaneously. And we tell the story of how this was done in these 8 universities, and make reference to many others. And there really are dozens of new universities coming together around the world. And one of the main takeaways, sort of a counterpoint to what you're saying, John, about how universities in the US are struggling, and especially liberal arts is kind of under fire, we found almost a mirror image around the world, especially in parts of the developing world, where liberal arts was really seen as a key to unlocking creativity and entrepreneurship in people. And this was a very refreshing, new, almost revolutionary type of education in many countries. And so it offers an alternative to burgeoning generations of young people who also, unlike the US, are in great abundance around the world. And if we look at sort of the numbers, where there's something like 40 million university students in India, and growing, and in Africa, something like 60% of the continent is under 25. You see almost a crushing demand for higher education in those regions of the world. And so new universities are desperately needed to help not only meet this demand quantitatively, but also to offer entirely new forms of education that are more creative, wide-ranging, and more true to the cultures too, and not out relics of colonial forms of education, of which many of these universities are in the developing world. So those are just a few of my key points to kind of frame the book.
Let me pick up from there, Brian. John, I'll just add a few points so we can start the conversation. As Brian indicated, that there's a larger context that we started with this, since both of us are US-based, which is the larger gloom and doom in American higher education, not just about small liberal arts colleges, but questions about the cost, about the value of the education being provided, about the quality, and sometimes, and as well, the things that you hear today, and they come from the left and the right in different ways, criticisms of universities in terms of their ability to actually handle difficult topics and to have students and faculty both study and discuss them. And so there are all those criticisms, and we were struck by how much the gloom and doom here contrasts with the sense of animation and aspiration. It's an interesting question to ask how much that continues today than when we started our project, and we may come to that. But in general, we were drawn to the energy and the enthusiasm of all these new ventures. So much of higher education is the way it was before, that it takes a long time to change higher education. And we were attracted to these moments when everything seemed to be open and protean. I think the two other things I'd mention are part of what we were attracted to, as well as the how, what Brian emphasized. How do you do this, and what do you learn, and what are the stories of academic heroism and failure, and what can we learn from that? Was also the what. What were these institutions trying to do? We were struck, for instance, by the number of institutions that concluded that, contrary to a lot of the trajectory in American universities, they wanted to build core curriculums, and often very global core curriculums, not pick one from this class and one from that category, but very much common knowledge and experience. They wanted, in many cases, not to have traditional departments, and certainly to advance far more interdisciplinary ways of structuring the faculty and the majors, that as a common thread across many of these universities. A number of them wanted to emphasize not just the content of what was taught, but to really get, we hear this term a lot, but I think it's not very well understood, to ask what are the actual habits and skills that we are trying to teach, and equally important, to focus on teaching as a profession rooted in the science of learning and needing the attention and focus if you're going to do it at the highest quality level, that sometimes can be difficult if you are a full-time researcher or if you are an adjunct shuttling between institutions. The last thing I'll just mention, and I'll do it briefly, is to say that you won't be surprised that the theme that emerges quite often is the relationship between the global and the local, or really the local, the national, and the global. As you have, whether it's a university in India that is adopting or adapting an American liberal arts approach, or it's a joint venture in Singapore or in Abu Dhabi, attempting to blend cultures. And what was impressive about those institutions, where they ran into problems, where there are still ongoing issues about the how much is this a colonial venture versus how much is this a new global kind of venture. So those are some of the themes that we have in the book, and I'll send it back to you, John.
Well, fantastic. I think at least your last comments get back to one of my questions, and that is, how do you balance the local with this global kind of perspective? And I suppose it partly relates to what enrollment you have at that institution. Minerva is an example of people from all over the world entering a small liberal arts college program, whereas your examples in India, are more localized, or Africa, your two examples in Africa, if I have that correct. So describe a little bit more, like, how do you balance? Does it really have to do with the institutional profile and enrollment, or, is it just an ongoing tension that you just can't completely resolve?
So I'll take the first crack at this. I think it's always an ongoing tension. In fact, in my involvement with Duke Kunshan University, one of our core principles we call rooted globalism. And you will automatically note that there's a tension built into that. What do you mean rooted and global together? And a lot of times you saw some of these universities, particularly the joint ventures, fall back on this language of global citizenship, which, for my money, doesn't get you very far, because it sometimes seems like it's really a way of saying these are universal values, which are Western values, or whoever is the most global wins. And that often came into tension with localities at Yale and US, where Brian was. They did a remarkable core curriculum where they truly built a global core. It wasn't just you study Rome, you also study the Ming Dynasty, you study Socrates, you study the Ramayana. On the other hand, there was a lot of tension about where was Singapore, where was Malaysian culture in all that. And so I think there's an ongoing set of tensions there. And sometimes the criticism is that these institutions remain too Western, not just at the surface level, but at the level that essentially they are teaching individualism, that liberal arts is steeped in a kind of individualism, not communal kind of thinking, and is connected to democratic citizenship. And then on the other hand, they're criticized for being too limited in their academic freedom, not enough academic expression, free expression. And that contrasts with well, it doesn't contrast, but then you saw other examples where, like in Vietnam or in India, we saw universities having to navigate those issues, but very much also trying to build a local culture, civilization that reflected that country and culture and history, rather than having it be diminished underneath a Western veneer.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on maybe it's a good opportunity to also remind of which universities we talked about and sort of do a quick rundown of how each of them was founded with an impulse toward not just helping the students, which of course was a key goal, but as a global project that was hoping to have world implications. So Minerva University, for example, was founded with students from all around the world and was really literally a global community, as the students would rove from one world city to the next, not based on any continent, but spending time in 8 or more world cities. Olin College of Engineering, also based in the US, but having a global impact by reshaping engineering education, literally having dozens of nationalities on their campus every summer, learning about engineering education. And this tiny school with just 400 students has already been ranked alongside MIT as the top in the world for engineering education. CSHE University in Ghana, a really amazing project that's the founder, Patrick Aoua, was talking about it as a mechanism for creating a renaissance in Africa. And it's a beautiful aspiration for bringing together students from across the continent to come together and become a new generation of ethical entrepreneurial leaders. African Leadership University, which has 2 campuses, hoping to eventually produce 3 million leaders across Africa. And these are, really transformative aspirations that these schools have, which take them beyond maybe some of the assumptions that a conventional university has, which are more rooted in the past and mostly inherited. I'll just very quickly list the last of them. NYU Abu Dhabi, built in what was hoped to be a global idea capital, containing 110 nations among the students, another really global effort. Also sort of in some ways redefining Arab studies with this Arab Crossroads program that they developed. Ashoka University in India, now its largest philanthropic project in the subcontinent there, now enrolling over 4,000 students and doubling in size just since its founding with two basically double-sized campus. Fulbright Vietnam, founded with funding from the US State Department. And then finally, Yale and US College, which I was part of, which was really an outgrowth of Singapore's multi-decade strategy to emerge as truly a first world nation in terms of fully planted in the center of the knowledge economy and transcending its earlier role as a transshipment point to really become a generator of new technologies and new ideas. So all these schools, by virtue of these aspirations, and also by virtue of having global communities of students, were able to really sort of embody a much deeper global impulse than most universities can.
Yeah, you know what? So one of my questions that I asked is, what is really scalable? A liberal arts education, I think, at least in our perhaps older version of it, is an expensive endeavor. We know AI and other kinds of things might change that, but the scale of these are pretty small. I mean, except for the, obviously what you're talking about in terms of Africa Leadership University. Seems to have a larger potential growth pattern. But, so how sustainable are these efforts? What's the financial model that you find? I mean, I know there's variation, but a lot of it has to do with, in a startup culture, kind of, an initial investment, sometimes from the private sector. I know in India, you see this, all of the private colleges, universities that have grown up beyond your example. So yeah, how scalable is this? What's the financial implications of these startups?
Well, I'm going to just bring out Noah's phrase, which is in the book, that we have a pluralist view of impact, which is that these schools, even though they're small by enrollment, have a disproportionate impact by virtue of their example they provide and by the sort of existence proof that they provide of this new format. And whether or not they are individually scalable, we could talk one by one. Some are, some aren't. By virtue of these aspirations that I mentioned before, they are really, I think, stretching themselves beyond what you might otherwise have called a boutique university. They really are creating cohorts of transformative types of leaders. And that's really part of their aspirations that make them a little different in terms of not really trying to hit the large scale of, say, a Western Governors or Southern New Hampshire University, which is also very important. And we make a point in the book to not in any way deprecate the value of those large scaled efforts, but recognizing the need for both to be developed simultaneously side by side, the intensive, highly personal forms of education that are in our sample alongside of the larger, more scaled types of education.
And about the finance side of it, which you discuss in the book, there are a lot of models that are shown in the startups, but can you just talk a little bit about, well, how are these funded and what's their sustainable model, business model, if I might say?
Well, I don't think there's a single model for any of them. I think it really does vary. You have some that are small, Fulbright in Vietnam, CSHE in Ghana. Those are small. They're probably going to stay relatively small. They have had to develop, just as in the US, the forms of philanthropy that enable them to make it affordable. The difference, of course, is that the cost there is about a sixth the cost of what it would take to do that in the US. So the notion there is high quality, but you can do it at a lower cost, and the students don't have to leave home in order to do that. But that's a fairly traditional model. Then you get others like that aspire to be larger. NYU Abu Dhabi, which has a massive research endeavor. It makes a big contribution to NYU's rankings because it's part of the NYU system, as well as tuition and the lavish funding from the government.
Right.
Even Ashoka, which aims to go to 10 or 20,000 students. So some of those are aiming to be what we call mid-sized private or public universities, and running on similar kinds of business models that we've seen. Then you have the two other types that are worth pointing out here. One are the sort of Minervas and the Olins, which are small, but their impact is very much through the demonstration effect. Olin has done this a little bit more just because people have come to see them. Minerva has had that, but Minerva, you mentioned the project, has also has an outreach approach to this. And that is, instead of trying to create a larger Olin or a larger Minerva, but to actually take some of the lessons and spread that so that you still have, you don't go to scale by getting larger, you go to scale by having an impact, so to speak, horizontally. And then last, you have something like African Leadership University, which has been driving down costs from 14,000 to 12,000 to 3,000, and is now, they started out, they wanted to build 25 campuses in Africa. And after building 2, they realized that the cost of just having students in the African countries come and go was itself so large that they wanted to figure out how to pivot to a regional hub model. So if you're in Nigeria and there's no campus there, can you access this kind of education, which is very much a learn by doing and taking advantage of online education and being part of the cooperative kind of experience. So they're the one that aims to, they now have campuses or hubs in New York and in Palo Alto. So they have global aspirations, but they are based on very much of a stripped down administrative and faculty model in order to make that work in the African context.
Yeah, if I could, John, I know you said no slides, but I just have one figure I want to share.
I didn't see
I'm gonna...
the slides. It's just one.
Okay, so I'm hoping that I'm getting this figure to you. You
Yes,
see it or not?
It's up.
Okay, then if you are able to see the figure, it shows kind of the parameter space of the universities that we talk about in the book, along with sort of sectors of universities. And because I'm a physical scientist by training, I like numbers and graphs and parameter spaces. And in the case of our schools, they're a wide range. They, some are indeed quite expensive per student, especially when considering the cost of living in the countries. But as Noah mentioned, these schools, by offering high quality liberal arts education at 1/7 or 1/8 the price of the US, they're able to retain a lot of students that otherwise would have gone abroad and maybe stayed abroad. And so this is a big part of their value, is they're able to provide a local form of the highest quality liberal arts education in country. And then in other cases like African Leadership University and ALX, they're really pushing the boundaries, trying to bring costs down to $3,000 a year per student. So they really are experimenting all across the parameter space.
So just for clarity, that was the tuition cost, not the actual estimate, which is always very vague as to what the actual cost is per student to teach or educate.
That's true.
Okay. Just want to clarify. That's a great slide. Well, let me ask a little bit more about the market position of these institutions. You noted it before, this kind of juxtaposition between what's happening in the United States in terms of a kind of a downgrading or market depression, shall we say. It may not be permanent, but for liberal arts colleges and liberal arts education. And then there's this interest internationally, which is, important. And I know there are probably a fair amount of people that are listening in that are American focused people and don't know about a lot of the constraints that are going on in major universities throughout the world, outside of the US in particular. And so, like, for one, is that, most students, it depends on where you are. In China, there's a 4-year undergraduate program. In Brazil, it's 3-year. In all of Europe, it's 3. So the 3-year program, most students enter they're physics majors. They are physics. They aren't taking courses across a spectrum of this general education kind of conceptual idea that we have more based in the United States. So there's a lot of constrictions going on in relationship to the curriculum. You know, in China, for example, you've got to take 3 or 4 courses in CSHE thought. So it eats up a lot of the curriculum if you're in an engineering major. In any case, there is this movement and this concept that, oh my gosh, you know, we really aren't creating creative people because of the constraints of these large universities, which is still the norm. So this interest in liberal arts education is driving, you know, is it partly an interest of governments realizing that maybe this is a path to create more innovative people. But it's still kind of a small component within these larger systems. And then the other thing is, which I'm getting to my question, sorry, is that, well, where's the demand? Do students, you know, like perceive that this is something they want to do? In your examples, I don't know what the enrollment demand is or how selective the admissions is. I mean, you give some indicators in it, but can you talk a little bit about, well, how does it fit into the market? How do students perceive it? Do they have, you know, a lot of applicants to these programs? Are they highly selective? So any comments about how they fit into this global world?
Sure, Brian, why don't I start and you pick up? Just before the enrollment part, I think, John, you put your finger on something really important, that there's a kind of gas and brakes going on in many countries around the world on this, which is to say, the same governments that are saying we want something more innovative, more creative, we want more Steve Jobs, are also the ones who impose on the existing systems the rankings and the financial models based on almost entirely on research outputs. And incentive systems. I mean, if you look in China at the schedule of students, you know, the number of days, the number of hours they spend in class, in just listening to lecture, it's completely at odds with any creative kind of approach, right? It just doesn't fit. But the existing model works that way. And so you can sometimes have, again, in China, the Party Congress, the Ministry of Education has called for all these kinds of changes that will sound very familiar to your ears. More creative problem solvers, more complex, able to deal with complexity, adaptability, entrepreneurial. And yet their systems are oppositional to that. So it's just both things are happening. In terms of and in part, I think that's why you see some interest in, oh, well, let's partner with someone else who has some experience to see what the experiments could be. And the question there is then, how successful are those experiments? And do they then have any impact elsewhere in the system? The success of most of these institutions that we studied is very high. I think it was harder to get into Yale and US than it was to get into Yale. Ashoka, I don't have the numbers at hand, but it's, you know, you pay $11,000 to get an incredible education in India versus paying $80,000 to go to New Haven.
Is there financial aid models in some of these institutions?
Most of them have developed. In Vietnam, they literally had to invent the notion of philanthropy to drive financial aid. So there is a financial aid system in most of these systems, which of course then recreates the fundamental problem of when that you can't sustain that. But these are highly sought after institutions. Partly because of their quality and frankly, partly because of their branding, right? The prestige that's associated with them.
Yeah, let me jump in and just give some numbers too. Actually, Minerva, according to the websites that I've just checked while we're talking, apparently has a selectivity of about 1%. It received 20,000 applicants and accepted 208 students, according to my sources. The other one's also very selective. As Noah mentioned, Yale and US was more selective than Yale when we opened it up. NYU Abu Dhabi around 4 to 5%, the CSHE around 16%. They're very selective, and Ashoka around 8%. And I should also mention that for Ashoka, it was an outgrowth of an earlier program called the Young India Fellowship, which we tell the story in the book about how Pramath Sinha, one of the founders, went through his whole undergraduate education, was sort of pushed into an IIT to learn metallurgical engineering. And he jokes he didn't even really know what metallurgical engineering was, but he knew he should study that because all good kids in India, when they're in IIT, are accomplishing the goal of many of their parents and other relatives. And when they opened up this Young India Fellowship, it was a postgraduate program for liberal arts. And they received thousands of applicants who had already graduated from all the best universities across India. And they created this amazing super cohort, which became sort of seeds of support and social capital for the later Ashoka University. They fanned out all across India and were an incredible resource. And this program, Young India Fellowship, also attracted Nobel Prize winners as guest lecturers and immediately generated the kind of prestige that made Ashoka University one of the top schools in India, which it is now, just only less than 20 years after its founding. So it's really remarkable to how it's meeting a need that's unmet in India for this more wide-ranging, more discursive, more questioning kind of education.
Well, let me ask you a few questions about academic freedom, free speech, these kinds of things, because this has obviously been an issue, whether it's NYU at Abu Dhabi, or I was going to also mention you didn't have it on your list, but Shanghai NYU, that adventure, which I know a little more about. But you have, or one of your examples that you talk about is the Fulbright University in Vietnam. And that is, when we're talking about academic freedom, we're also kind of talking about institutional autonomy. So why don't you talk a little bit about, like, what are the range of issues that these universities have faced when they're operating in a nation state that could be, like in India, have a strong movement of Hindu nationalism, or efforts to kind of maybe not see the liberal arts education as necessarily something they like. I don't know how to do that. But in any case, say a few things about institutional autonomy and academic freedom in your examples.
Sure. I mean, the two examples you gave, a brief note on Fulbright and then more on Ashoka. I think Fulbright, I'm not as up on where they are currently. It was a big concern, obviously, at the beginning. And we even had there was a subheading in the book, I think we called Teaching Animal Farm in Ho Chi Minh City. Which they did. They tried to figure out creative ways of teaching openly. And in many ways, their challenges have been more internal than external. Should you stand in the middle of the square and criticize the party? No. That's a difference from talking about ideas in the classroom, right? About capitalism or communism or something like that. Ashoka has had a much more difficult time of this. They have had several controversies where at one point the vice chancellor, the head academic leader, was a very prominent Indian writer, journalist, academic who wrote publicly. And he was very outspoken in his criticism of the Modi government. And on the one hand, that's why, he's an academic and that's what he should be doing. On the other hand, he's the president of this nascent, essentially the president, the equivalent of this nascent institution. And it did not go well. And when he stepped down, there were a lot of protests around that the university has lost its academic freedom. More recently, they had another row over an investigation of economic department faculty members' paper. And so they are caught in a very different, it's the same thing that we might be caught of here in the US, but it's much more delicate, right? These are rarely black and white kind of issues. They tend to be more, lots of things get said in the classroom, but is somebody speaking out who's the head of the university and writing that this is a fascist government? Well, how do you manage that in terms of the role of the president versus what a faculty member might say? And so they're very delicate, and Ashoka tried to resolve that by putting in place an ombudsman to deal with these issues. And I would say it's a work in progress, as I understand it. There's a lot of
Yeah.
pressures, because if you give in too easily, you see the problem. But if you simply assert your autonomy as if you were in Princeton, New Jersey, you're not. You're in New Delhi. It's different.
Yeah, our book does not shy away from this topic. We go in some detail about the controversies at Yale and US and Singapore, about Ashoka University's conflicts with the BJP government, about how Fulbright Vietnam navigated its way through the Ho Chi Minh thought requirement, which is how this animal farm teaching actually came in. Really an amazing coup for them. And actually in the book, we make a point that in some ways, it's really a more courageous to take on this hard task of advancing intellectual freedom and human creativity in these sort of imperfect circumstances. And there's a little quote in the book here where we talk about what might be thought of as a moral division of labor, in which proponents of unfettered academic freedom might be defending garden walls, and institution builders like the ones we write about, they're actually tending new vines growing in more inhospitable terrain. And there is a certain amount of courage that requires this balance between pragmatism and idealism. And we talk about how in various ways this balance is reached, and how in other cases the balance is still a work in progress.
Well, there's echoes here in the United States on all of that with the various tensions going on with this terrible war, and then other issues that are dividing people on campus in different ways than like the 1960s. So in any case, these issues are universal, but also very specific sometimes. You know, I just wanted to back on the Yale NUS example, Ryan, which you were part of. At least it was my impression that one of the aspects, although there's some mystery as to why NUS decided in this relationship with Yale, had to do with the national government and how they viewed. They have very restrictive policies about what anybody can say, but particularly people who are not citizens of Singapore. You were really not allowed to say hardly anything. No, you can't say anything except for one public square, I think it is, or maybe the nationals aren't allowed. I'm getting this mixed up. But the point is that this was a point of tension dealing with Yale and its sense of what is an independent, you know, semi-independent college, liberal arts college, versus what NUS. So wasn't that a root of one of the reasons why NUS decided to end? The one example you have of your 8, which didn't survive in the form that it was originally done, because it still does survive, doesn't it, as kind of an entity, more like a university college model that the union has. So sorry.
Yeah, the way it resolved was they just dropped the Yale from the Yale NUS College, so it's now NUS College. So it does function much like a university college within the boundaries of the larger NUS campus. And yeah, it was something of a mystery, you know, sort of the who killed JR type thing, where we're trying to figure out why did Yale NUS close. And everyone was, as we say in the book, we record the term gobsmacked came up because the Yale leadership was stunned at this closure. And there are some that point to finances. The cost was over twice per student of the larger NUS. Pericles Lewis, who recently wrote a piece in the Daedalus about new universities, felt that it might have also come from a desire among Singaporeans for a more egalitarian approach to higher education, whereas Yale and US was really, and to its core, an elitist project, like top 4%, you know, got in very much in the pattern of Yale, and that somewhat at odds with the more egalitarian sensibility within Singapore.
A focus on enrollment, right? So this was also a question of how many Singaporeans have access.
Yeah, exactly. And half of those students being from abroad was really meaning that tax dollars from Singapore were subsidizing these elite educations for all these different international students, which in the early days was part of a strategy of Singapore to become a global talent magnet. But there was something of a retrenchment of that in later years as more of a Singaporeans first type attitude began to become more prevalent among the population. The government then really felt uncomfortable with lavishing such resources on international students. And yeah, there was also a couple of very high-profile conflicts between the government and Yale and US that did happen. We talk about it in the book. So I think all these factors together were the reasons why Yale and US closed. We can't point to any one as being the determinative factor, but the combination of them actually made it unsustainable in a longer term, unfortunately.
One thing, among many things that's really great about your book is that, yes, it's about organizational management and how you get this and how you get the money, but it's a lot about the politics and kind of the cultural issues related to doing these enterprises, which are very enlightening, I think. So one other question related to autonomy is, well, what is the legal sanction or status of these institutions? It must vary a lot. I guess Yale and NUS would have been just, I don't know if the Singaporean government did have to approve, if I recall. So what is the legal status of these of your various startups?
Legal status.
Well,
it varies
they
completely
all
by country.
Did they all have to have actual government sanction to exist? What were the parameters of those legal those legal acts or statutes? Just any little information as to what is.
And it varies between, so joint ventures, right? So NYU Abu Dhabi, like NYU Shanghai, is both an NYU degree. It's part of the NYU system. It's part of their accreditation system. And it has a China-facing degree and it has to have a China Ministry of Education accreditation. Yale and US was not a Yale degree. Faculty voted against that. So Brian, you may know this better, but it was, Yale was deeply, deeply involved, but it was an NUS degree, right?
Yeah, it was more akin to how, yeah, go ahead.
And then you have a lot of what we saw with many of our universities. This could be, take African Leadership University or Minerva University. You have this problem, right? You're trying to create something new. But even people who say they want something new immediately ask you, how is it meeting the standards that we already have? So parents and students say, how do you know that this new program will get our kids jobs, right? Or why is the Yale and US curriculum different from the Yale? We just want the Yale one. And then there's accreditors, right? And accreditation, of course, is an important function that can really help universities. But it also can stifle all this innovation, because how does it determine, well, are you doing the credit hour we want? Do your majors look like ours? Minerva University had to incubate as part of the Keck Graduate School for 10 years before it could become fully an independent accredited institution. And in African Leadership University, they basically had to say, look, we're creating the majors just like you want. They look like exactly what the accreditors want, but then they would fill them with the kinds of things that they actually wanted to do. And there's a degree of a Trojan horse thing going on there, because there's a lot of pressures from the existing, from prestige institutions, from parents and students, and from governments to say, give us something new, just like the old thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Noah mentioned this Trojan horse. Sometimes you think cat and mouse as well, because you want to be different, but also the same as existing universities at the same time. So you're doing this incredible kind of shape shifting depending on who's looking at you. And in many cases, you want to emulate the most conservative, the most employable type of degree. And we talk about how ALU in particular, they were doing something completely unconventional. So they ended up putting a label of computer science on what they were doing. But then in other cases, you also have to do legal maneuvers. So some of the schools like Ashoka are located in an adjacent state of Haryana, which was required in order to get the law passed from the state government so that they could then found the university. So in some cases, the federal government is inseparable from higher education, unlike in the US, where we have, thankfully, separation. And so you have to maneuver around federal, state, and other figures that are always trying to stamp down anything that looks unfamiliar. So this is another reason why universities have so much trouble changing, because they're navigating the tension in being recognizable to students, parents, and employers, while also trying out new things that might actually produce better kinds of outcomes that haven't been tested before.
Well, the US stands as an exception. We don't have a Ministry of Education that has broad powers that you find in almost everywhere, I think, in the world. So I'm sure that it must be interesting political stories related to relationships with ministers in some form for some of these adventures. But so just a couple of questions related to management. I know that we don't have too much more time, but you do just discuss back to this theme of sustainability. You talk a little bit about the financial side. But one of the issues too is like, well, who are the faculty and how long do they stay? They might be attracted, like the NYU example in Singapore, adventure there was, the promise of faculty at NYU being there, but then over time that, the interest kind of wanes and you have to have your own faculty. And then attention as well, I think over time as the institution matures to some degree between the teaching responsibility of the faculty and the research productivity. I mean, when you think of liberal arts, you think of, generally labor intensive jobs for faculty and that, you want to sustain people over time and all of that. So a little bit about, well, how do they retain faculty? What's the recruitment process? Is it going to be different now than it was, 4 years ago, 5, 6, when these institutions started up?
Well, I think the response to that draws in part on what Brian and you were just talking about, John, which is the innovation versus the traditional ways of doing things. A lot of these, we were quite interested to see that 5 out of 8 of our schools basically either don't award tenure or award tenure entirely for or primarily for teaching. Now, when I say they don't award tenure, you may start thinking, oh, this is the adjunct model. People are poorly treated. They teach, high loads. And it's not that way at all at most of these places. These are institutions that concluded that they're trying to change the educational system. And that can be in the US, like at Olin College or with Minerva, or it can be in any of the countries we've talked about. And to do that, the notion that research and teaching always go together or are deeply linked, they wanted to break. They actually believed that if you're going to focus on the highest quality level of teaching, you had to have faculty who were recruited for that purpose, who were rewarded for that purpose, who were, that there was a much higher bar to what quality teaching looked like. It had to be rooted in more than just happenstance of being a good teacher. And so there was a real challenge to the existing model we have and that Brian and I grew up loving, the scholar-teacher model. And that was a fundamental challenge to much of what we saw. And the evolution of this has been that sometimes, like at Olin College, there was a moment early on in the first few years where the idea was, okay, let's look like everyone else. We need more research. And the faculty felt like, wait a minute, you're changing the goalposts here. And they really had to have a moment of clarity. Are we going to be like everyone else? Or do we need to look like MIT? Or can we stay distinct and admired by MIT because of our focus on our distinct approach? And each one of these institutions often goes through that. Brian?
Yeah, and part of the rationale for our book is that we actually did select a sample of institutions for which teaching was a primary mission. And in addition to these global aspirations, really sort of pushing the envelope, the highest quality teaching was all part of the sample. And so that's one reason why we chose the schools we did. And also because their mission is simplified, there are fewer tensions among faculty members about why they're there. And there are also organizational differences as well, that almost all of these schools abolish departments, for example. So a faculty member's primary identity is with a much larger interdisciplinary group. And in many cases, they also feel common ownership of the curriculum because they've created it themselves. So we find that these common curricula are very common in these new institutions. They play a really important role for melding together a cohesive group of faculty and also for providing a coherent type of education for the students. In some cases, students are all taking the same course at the same time, and it sort of then ripples through their co-curricular life in ways that are really exciting. And this is a kind of opportunity that's often missed in more conventional schools where students just take a handful of courses here and there. So all the students are in very different places in terms of what they're thinking, in terms of their vocabulary, their conceptual frameworks. So a lot of these schools were able to kind of redefine what it means to be a teacher scholar on the faculty side, and also do experiments with how a student life could be constructed and have it be more coherent and more rooted in this sort of conversations across all these different dimensions of learning.
So most of these institutions are recruiting faculty globally, correct? I mean, that's to be. So I take it English is almost always the common denominator of courses. So we should probably have noted that. So that has some elements there.
That does. And John, it's worth, if I can just add one sentence on this. I think part of what we saw was, we talk at the end of the book about these centrifugal and centripetal forces, and at most universities, individual faculty, their community is really their community of scholars through their laptop out there in the world, which is wonderful, but it also pulls them away from the actual community there. And what we were impressed by the way in which the larger mission of these schools to redefine the region or power the economy in Vietnam, or to change leadership in Africa, or to fundamentally change education in through Minerva or Olin. That external mission reinforced and kept many faculty deeply involved in the institution because they had a mission to what they were doing. And the mission was the institution, not just their own individual work. And that was impressive.
Well, we're getting down to the last couple of minutes, and I have my concluding question. I have integrated some questions from the chat and from our previous emails about the program. And that is, okay, so how many of these institutions do you think will exist in the form that they are in another 10 years? And then related to that, because you do an excellent job, I think anybody who wants to start up a new institution of some sort, that your book is an incredible resource. So, and do you think we're going to see more of these institutions in a significant tick up? One thing I will say is we have seen the trajectory related to branch campuses, tremendous, enthusiasm for branch campuses, largely driven by great dreams of income and revenue. I would say. So lots of adventures that were kind of amiss and many imploded. But in any case, back to the question is, will these keep going, do you think, in never mind NYU, NUS? And do you see a trend that we're going to see more of these startups?
So I'll just say quickly, I think the wind is against a lot of the joint ventures, as you say, but I'm struck by the number of people out there, entrepreneurs, some from inside universities, many from outside, who I just turn every corner and there's somebody wanting to start a new university. So we're in a pushback against globalization age, but I'm not sure we're in a pushback against innovative new kinds of universities, because despite all the universities we already have, there's a powerful sense amongst people who are willing to be courageous to say that the established system isn't meeting what we need. So I think we're going to see more of those, even if less of the global reach universities.
And those are driven a lot by people with money, right? This is more private sector kind of innovation, probably.
A lot of private sector. It can be funded by the government, right? So it depends, but there's definitely a lot of private sector. Fred Swanaker at ALU has leveraged a lot of public and private money in different ways. But the privates are definitely going to be out there. The question is, are they going to be more the fly-by-night, we have an app to solve your problems? or are they going to be sustainable, real institutions?
Yeah, because there is a huge for-profit sector in all various parts of the world that quality is very low, and it's also, but those are a different beast. But there's a lot of private sector
That's right.
activity that's really about money. But sorry, so Brian, final words on what we just discussed?
Yeah, just to kind of also point out that when the university starts, it has no prestige and it has no social capital. But now that these schools are 5, 10, 20 years old, they have that. They have prestige and social capital, and their enrollment pressure is there. The results are kind of speaking for themselves. The students have now moved forward into many high leadership roles, starting companies, doing amazing work. And in some cases, just like in the US, you have elite students doing elite things. So where's the value add? But in other cases, you're actually attracting whole groups of students who otherwise might not have been part of the recipe. And all of these schools do have very good financial aid, even in places which didn't have any financial aid in the past. So you're seeing a certain stream of students coming into these schools that are doing really impressive things that otherwise would have been impossible had they not been given the very generous financial aid that places like NYU, Abu Dhabi, Minerva, other schools offer. So I think those results, I think, will keep them going for many decades to come.
All right, so really nice book, really great. You guys did a great job on it. It's very informative. And again, I'll just say the mantra for my mantra was the liberal arts are dead. Long live the liberal arts. In any case, all right. Thank you so much, and thank you for those that have participated. This will be online as well, and not too distant future. So thanks again. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.